things. It just wasn't hooked up to my computer before. Okay, so we got this thing. We have our quiz. Let's look at the collab, right? So the first thing I would do is just like map this stuff out, right? So one thing to note, right, when you're looking at this stuff is basically like what you care about or what kind of like you should be, just be like very aware of is our foreign keys, right? Like a lot of these tables, I believe, don't have any foreign keys. So we don't really care too much about them. So for example, the actors table, no foreign key, right? There's the primary key, but that's it, just ID and name. Directors is the same, ID and name. Movies has more stuff, but again, no foreign key here. Writers, no foreign key. So far, there's like nothing to remember. Just like, these are just objects. And then now we have this pattern, right? The way that we're connecting a movie to an actor is through this movie actors table. The way that we connect a movie to a director is through this table, and then the same thing with a writer. So if you're doing any of this stuff, right, if we're gonna like draw this out, for all of them, we have like our movies table, probably like in the center, and then we have, if we want to connect to writers, it'll be movies, writers, something like that. And what this has on it is like an ID, a movie's ID, and a writer's ID. Right? And now that's going to connect to like a movies table, to a writer's table. Okay? And again, this just has like an ID and a name. All I'm really paying attention to is this guy. Now, of course, we'll do the directors one. Let's just do that. This is the same, right? We have this directors table here. And then we connect the movies directors, or I'm going to double check the name of the table. Yeah, let's make this bigger. Make this font this one. Oh, yeah. Okay, so the movies directors, and that has a movies ID and a director's ID. And when you start writing this stuff out, like what you should do in your brain at least, if not in reality, is like fill in some data, right? Like here we have an ID of like 1. We have a movie ID, let's say of like 2, and a director's ID, let's say of 3. And with this, and then you just want to make sure you know what all this stuff means. So this is saying that this movie, whatever it is, let's say Jurassic Park, right, had a director of, Steven Spielberg, and that had, and his ID is 3, right, on the director's table. His ID would be 3. This value right here, this ID, this just represents the link, right? Like each row here represents the link between a particular movie and that director. All right. So the next thing, if we look at one of these queries, a lot of them operate the same. Find the director who made the movie The Martian, right? The main issue we have is like, how do we connect movies and directors? So, you could start with like the join table. It depends. It doesn't really matter. What you want to pay attention to, and this is something I saw, just floating around rooms, is like the order of operations in SQL. Maybe I'll put out a reading on that. Just remember, like when you have this word like from, what you should imagine is it's loading this table into memory, right? That's what SQL is doing for us. Let's do like limit 3. Cursor is not defined, so we need to run this. And we'll run this. So we're going to load in this movie directors table. So that's this thing right here. And then what we're going to want to do is just find the link where, find, this will have all the rows, right? Has all the links. So for every movie, show me a row for every director. So this is a lot of rows right here. We want just the rows where the director's name is, I forget, like Ridley Scott, right? So to do that, we're going to need to load in the directors table. So one thing I talk about, like I've given this analogy to some of you all at least, is like with these tables, you're like playing hopscotch. It's like if we start with, we can also, we start here. The only way you get to go, you can't, say we start with movies. You can't go directly to actors, right? You have to first, you only get to travel by foreign keys. Right? So you can't go here because there's no foreign key linking you to that. Here, we're good to like make our jump because we have an ID and a title, and we have a movies.id, which we can then like jump to this movie directors.movie ID. Okay? So it's like, you're just playing a game, and the rule is you can only load in or join in a table if there's that link. All right, so let's actually start here. We'll do select all from movies, just to make that point a little bit better. So select all from movies. Number 3. So these are our 3 movies, right? And now I want to, I have this issue because into memory I've loaded this thing, but I want to find those movies where the director is Ridley Scott. But I can't just do directors, right? There's no foreign key linking them. But what I can do is load in this table and link this guy through the foreign key. So let's do that. So we have select all from movies, join movie directors. Let's just make sure that's the name. Yeah, movie directors. And now I have to say how it links on, right? That takes me here. So I'm joining them on this guy equals this guy, right? Movies.id equals movie directors.id. Cool. On movies.id equals movie directors.id. And we should just see like more columns loaded in. Let's do, did I select all? Let's say limit 1. So we see a single column. See, here's the movie, and then I'm guessing these are like the IDs, right, from the movie directors table. So what we have now, in fact, if we want to, remember we could have done this pd.reSQL statement here and pass through like the connection object. Let's see if that works, just so we can see the columns. You see this? So here's my movie columns, and then here's the movie director columns, right? So all we've done right now is we've just joined, we've done that hopscotch where we've gone from here to here. So now what you should imagine, like just thinking about what SQL actually does, is all we've done is we've loaded both tables into memory, right? And we've joined, like linked them up properly. So we've loaded into memory from movies, join on movie directors. Yes, Serge?
So are you joining like on movies, the ID equals movie directors?
Yeah, thank you. I'm doing this all wrong,
Sorry.
aren't I? Dot movie ID. See that? This was not good at all. So that's one, yeah, thank you for that. I guess those mistakes are easy to make. All right, now this maybe is better. All right, so one check, right, you can kind of see is like, you just look to make sure this word, movies.id, pretty closely matches this, right? This is the foreign key. So this is my primary key matching to my foreign key. All right, so that's good. So far we've gotten this and this taken care of, and now we need to go to this other table. And the thing that links me is, again, this foreign key can link to this primary key. So I have movie directors dot director ID. This is director ID should equal directors.id. So I'll say join movie directors dot director ID equals directors dot ID limit 1. Well, let's just separate these out. All right, I'm using the triple quotes, which allows me to separate this into multiple lines. So select all from movies. All right, so we're loading movies into memory. Now we're loading up the join the movie directors, and we're joining from the movies.id equal to this movie ID, right? This primary key should equal this foreign key. That makes sense. And now we want, look, another mistake. What else do we want to join? Join the directors on this movie directors dot director ID. So that's this table should equal this new table of directors dot ID, right? So that's why I'm linking movie directors dot director ID should equal this directors dot ID. Okay, so let's just make sure again. We can look this up. I don't know if these values are correct. I guess they must be if it seemed like the movies made sense. Okay, and now what do we need to do? Let's say where. You can see here's the director's name. So in this case, we want to do where directors.name equals, and I'm looking for Ridley Scott, right? Oh no, the director who made the movie The Martian. So I need to do where movies.title equals The Martian. Okay? So this column is loaded up because I have loaded the whole table in here, right? So I basically have 3 tables loaded up. At this point, movies, movie directors, and directors. And now I'm limiting the rows to those where the movie's title equals The Martian. All right. And now finally I can limit the columns if I just want to see the director name, right? So how do I do that? We could do directors.id, comma directors, right, .name, right? These are my 2 table prefixes. So table directors, column ID, table directors, column name. That's 1. Or we could do directors star, right? Give me all the columns, display all the columns from the directors table. Okay. So I just say, like, it's worth. I think a lot of you did draw this out, which made me, of course, happy. But it's worth doing it, right? Because then you always have this as a reference to just go back to when things get harder. Right? It only takes a minute. Cool. Okay, so now let's move on to this part of the lab. So this class director, we have this console. So the first thing I might do is just load up the console. -e -i. Oh, it's in the back end, isn't it? So go to the back end, Python 3 -i console.py. Right, so this runs that, and now immediately we get an error, which says, okay, director takes no arguments. So this is just a classic mismatch, right? It's trying to pass through arguments, but it seems like our class does not take any arguments. So it could be either. It could be like this is making a mistake, or it could be my class is making a mistake. In this case, right, it's the class. So we def init self, and then we want to do, what is the name, the ID and the full name. ID, full name, and just make sure I get the underscore right. And then we do self.id equals the ID, self.fullname equals the full name. Right, so this is, we're going to take these values, ID equals 5, full name equals this guy, and pass it through, and then assign these attributes. Just make sure this works now. All right, so this looks good. Director, and then director.dunderdict. Cool. So it seems like this was initialized properly. So what's next? I mean, we did have these things of like the first name, things like that. Just the only thing to point out is that you don't need to go to the database for any of this, right? Like if I ask you right here for the first name, you can do that by doing director.fullname.split, and then just select the first one, right? This is the first name. So all you need to do is just copy this code, and remember inside the class, of course, this should be self, right? Because this is the instance itself. And we should probably return this value. Right? So this instance is full name, split it to turn it into a list, and then select the first one. Let's just make sure this works. Director, first name. All right, and that looks good. All right, let's move on to the movies. So this is the same thing. So the first thing I'm thinking to myself is like, all right, well, how do I get access to the database? And the answer is through the console. Right? So you can do, here I'm connecting to the database. And our cursor equals connection.cursor to create a new connection cursor object. And then what I can do over here is I can do something with director.movies and then pass through the cursor. So I'm passing through, this like represents my database, right? I'm passing through the connection to the database, and then this object, right, is going to be caught by this method, right? And I'll get it right here. And finally we can execute. So we execute cursor.fetchAll, and then we can return this stuff. All right, and we just return this. So now we want to return all of the movies related to this director. Okay, so this is, first of all, this is very similar to what we did over here. Well, almost, right? The only difference is that it's like where directors dot ID, I guess, equals some specific ID, right? So if I do something like this, this is the movie that was made by, let's just do star, that was made by the director with ID equal to 2, right? And that's essentially what I want to do, right? The question that I have, that I'm given here, is find all the movies made by this instance's director. Okay? So let's just write this out. So the query. So we select all from, I guess we'll start with directors. Like that's where we are. Select all from directors. Join. Notice, by the way, that like the order of loading up the tables doesn't really matter. Like what I'm paying attention to is like that game of hopscotch. Like I'm starting now with the directors table. I know I'm going to need to load in the movies table because that's my result. So it's like, how do I get from directors to movie, right, to over here, right? It's through joining this. So join the movie directors on, and now it's directors dot ID equals movie directors dot director ID, right? So I'm just double checking this lines up with this, right? And now I want to join the third table. So join, because I need to return movies, and I haven't gotten there yet. So join movies on movies.id equals movie directors dot movie ID. So again, we're making sure this aligns with this. So much of these bugs are just like I want to write a lab of just like mismatches, right? That just has like mismatches. So many of these bugs are just matching things up, right? And that's really like, I guess so much of coding is just, all right, square peg, square hole, just make sure these things match up. So we have these movies, cursor.execute the query, return it. If I do this, this will return everything, right? There's no where clause limiting this. So we don't want to return all the movies. We want to return the movies where what? That are related to this director. So we can say where where directors.id equals question mark, and then which ID is this, right? So it's the ID of the instance we're in, right? So if this is this guy, and now I want to find all those movies where the director ID equals 5. So when I call this method, this instance, right, I'm going to reference this as self when I do something like director.movies. So that means it should be self.id. Let's see if this works, then we can refactor it and can just explain a little bit more. So this is my director. Cool. And then do director.movies. And it works. Oh, I need the cursor. So missing one required positional argument cursor. I have the cursor. So where am I right now? I'm in console.py, right? If I look at console.py, I have a cursor object that I'm free to pass through. So I can do movies, pass the cursor, and now, I don't know, like maybe just look at one of these. Let's just select the first one. So yeah, this looks right? This is this guy's movie. All right. Okay, let's refactor this. Before I do, any questions about this, about what we did here? Oh, let's explain it just one part. Some people, I've seen a few people doing some weird stuff around here. Just remember what this is. This is this value with a that has the comma right after it. That's a tuple, right? If you don't, if you just try to do this, see that this is the number 1. Okay, for this to be a tuple, you need a comma, at least one comma. Okay. So that's why we put the comma in there. If you have multiple numbers, obviously this comes naturally. But if you're initializing a tuple, right, you need a comma. Otherwise, it's just going to be the number 1. And this method requires that you pass through like a tuple or a list, something like that. The second thing is just understanding this method. So this is the cursor.execute method. It takes 2 arguments to it, right? The first argument is the query. So that's why it's like query is this string, comma. The second argument is the tuple. So this is like the number, whatever this guy's number is. I think it's 5, right? It's this number. And then where it's taking this value and replacing the question mark with the number 5. So where director's ID equals 5. So that's how that works. And again, this is another aligning thing. This is a particular director's ID. We want to match it where this director's ID is 5. Okay? And then finally, so any questions about that? So you're just, as a sanity check, so much of this stuff right here is just making sure that the value on the left side, should equal the value on the right side. Right? These two things are equivalent. Find where the director's ID equals the current director's ID. Find where the movie's primary key is the same thing as the movie director's movie ID, right? Which makes sense. These are, this is the related row from the movie director's table that aligns with this current table we loaded in. All right, and then the last thing we can do is, I don't know if we need this director's table. If you think about it, we need, and I'm not sure, but if you think about it, we need movies. We want to get the list of the movies. So first of all, maybe I'll just do movies.star, because those are the columns that I care about, right? And now, so I need to return all the columns from the movies table. And then let's just say from movie directors, So select movie dot star from movies. From movies. Join movie directors. If I can do that. So we're going to select the columns from movies. That will give me this thing. And I'm going to join the movie directors table. And let's just say where the movie directors.director ID equals 5, right? Or equals self.id. Right? So I don't think I need this directors table at all. Right? So it makes my query easier. It takes a little bit less time, which is great too. So select movies that start from movies. Join the movie directors on what? On movies.id, if I want to link these two from one to the other, go from movies.id to movies director.movie ID. That makes sense. And only show the rows where the movie directors dot director ID equals self.id equals this current director's ID. Okay. Let's see if that makes sense, if this works. So we should get back essentially the same values. So we have our director, we have director.movies cursor. Let's just look at the first one again. Apocalypse Now, right, that was made by him. And like, you know, I don't know, we could make sure the director ID is always 5 or whatever. But this seems fine. Remember, again, like you can always put a breakpoint here. So if you want to hit the breakpoint, we just exit out of here. Oh, we're in my breakpoint right now because I call this method here. Let's count this out. So here's my director. If I want to hit this breakpoint right here, I should need to call this method. So do director.movies, pass through the cursor. That will execute this method and then pause right here. So now we're right in this line. And now you can just poke around, like look at what self is. That's the main thing you want to do. Or you can just experiment with the query, do cursor to execute, start building up this query until it works. But obviously having access to a breakpoint, quite useful. We can look at the self.dunder dict, see what these things are. Say, okay, this director's ID of 5 should equal movie directors.director ID. That's it. Okay. Feel fine? Yeah? Question, like, let's try to understand this. If there are questions, let's take some time. I mean, one thing that could make it easier is just thinking about the hard-coded value. Like where, if I want to get all the movies related to this particular director, right? It's where, give me all the rows where the director's ID is 5. So then you could think about hard-coding the value 5 here. But then, of course, we want it to change every time I call this movie with a different director. So it's like, how do I make sure this lines up to the director ID? Right? Well, that's just self.id, right? Because we're inside a director object. So you can always, go from like very explicit to then more abstract to find the answer. All right. Let me stop.